Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, here in the Flemish Parliament, but also online following us here. I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce to you the keynote speech giver of our conference, which is Professor Mary Kaldor. For those of you who are interested in peace and conflict studies, she needs hardly any introduction since her decades of work on various aspects of peace, security, arms, and so on have really been very impactful in the academic world, the policy debate, but also in societal debates. Professor Kaldor is currently Professor Emeritus of Global Governance and Director of the Conflict Research Program at the London School of Economics and Political Science. We are very honored that Professor Kaldor has accepted our invitation to give the keynote speech today. And in her speech, she will try to reflect on the following questions. Has the war in Ukraine changed the way in which we think and look at war and peace? Do we need to rethink our security structure? And what are the implications for peace research? And after her speech, there will be some time for a short Q&A session. And then after that, we can all go and start the connecting again with a short reception and drink. So I'd like to give you the floor.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I wanted to come really because I think it's a very important moment for peace research. I think we're at a kind of turning point. Some people call it an inflection point, where I actually think, and there aren't very many of those moments, when peace research can really make a difference. And that's really what I want to talk about. How do we make a difference? What do we have to do to make a difference? How do we explain this inflection point? You know, we are facing what President Biden called cascading crises: climate change, pandemics, the war in Iraq, the war in Sudan. And they are existential crises. They're existential not only in the sense that they actually kill large numbers of human beings, but they actually threaten humanity itself. And I think that existential crisis arises from the fact that our political institutions are completely ill-adapted to economic, social, and ecological change. We're stuck in an old-fashioned nation-state system when we need to move towards a really effective multilateral system. It doesn't mean the end of states, but it means that states become nodes in a system of global governance. And I think at the core of that, which is why I think peace research is so important, is the role of security. Because in a sense, security is kind of central to the nature of political authority, to the nature of political institutions. And so what I want to talk about, I thought I would talk about, is that what we need at this moment, and I think there are reasons for thinking it's a good moment to be talking about this, is a fundamental change in security culture. And I say culture because I don't just mean policy. I mean, you know, what we see, the problem with security is that it's deeply embedded in our state structures, in military structures, in narratives, in ways of thinking, in rules. And we need a change in all of that, which is why we need a change in security culture. I think the other thing to say is not just it's about culture, but security itself is a very odd word. And it actually is quite an ambiguous word, because we sometimes, when we talk about security, we sometimes just mean safety. And we assume that's what we mean, is safety. But actually, in everyday language, when we talk about security, we don't talk about safety, we talk about security practices. So we talk about the security services, the armed forces, the intelligence services, the police. We talk about door locks. And actually, they don't necessarily contribute to safety. And there's not always a simple correlation between objective and practices. And a culture, there are all sorts of very difficult questions that we can ask ourselves. Why, for example, do the Americans continue with their campaign of airstrikes against supposed terrorists when we know that not only have they not succeeded in stopping the problem of extremist Islam, it's been increasing? Why do the wars that we study in places like Syria or Congo just go on and on and on? And you can't understand that except from the vantage point of a culture. So what's interesting about security is that in part you're talking about the safety of human beings, but in part you're talking about deep-rooted political institutions, and they don't necessarily match. And the question is, how do we bring about that coming together again? So what I want to do in the time that's remaining is, I first of all want to talk a little bit more about what I mean by a security culture. I then want to talk a little bit more about the moment and why the Ukraine war has actually introduced such a moment, which brings about a change in our thinking. And finally, what are the opportunities, particularly for those of us on the European continent, because I think that's where the opportunities are greatest for change. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And let me start with what I mean by security culture. Many of you may be familiar with the term strategic culture. And the term strategic culture was developed by the Rand Corporation in the 1950s, because they had all these predictive models about how the Russians would react rationally to whatever they did in terms of acquiring arms. And the Russians did not react the way they expected. And so they came up with the answer that every country has a different culture, a different way of doing armaments or of doing the military sector, and they called it strategic. And I think so I started to use the term security culture to answer these puzzling questions. I mean, originally I began because I actually had a research project around what I called the security gap, namely that millions of people in the world are deeply insecure. And yet our security forces, the military, etc., don't make them more secure. In fact, they make them more insecure. So, and I think I suddenly realized I was comparing apples and pears. The security services are designed around the threat of an attack by a foreign state, not by the kinds of insecurity most people feel every day. And a security culture is one in which somehow the objective and the practices come together. And at the moment, we do have a real problem, which is what I'm going to explain. So my notion of security culture differs from strategic culture in three senses. First of all, of course, it's not just about the military. Strategic culture was about military and military strategy. Secondly, it's not national. Strategic culture was very much about why the Russians arm, why the Germans have the sort of military force structure they do. It's about ways of doing things. So it's actually global, because in fact you could say that the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Pentagon are part of the same geopolitical or military security culture. So it's about ways of doing things rather than about nations. And thirdly, and perhaps this is the most important, it's not essentialist. There is a kind of essentialist element in the notion of strategic culture. You know, the British will always emphasize the Navy because it has seas around it, and it always has. The Russians always favor artillery because it always has. And actually, I think the key point about security cultures is they have to be constructed, and they have to be reproduced and reconstructed. they don't every generation, every few years, they're constantly in a process of change. And if you understand that process of change, you can identify moments that are pathways, contradictions, big events, when you've run out of money, something or other that makes it possible to start pushing things in a different direction. And that's why thinking in a constructivist way is so important. I think obviously 1989 was such a key moment that opened up the possibilities of change. And I think this is another moment. And that's why I think what we have to really be thinking about is how do we shift from what you might call an old Cold War culture, or a geopolitical culture which has persisted, to a human-centered, a human security culture. It's in the air, but it hasn't trickled down and affected structures and institutions and so on. So let me say, before I talk about that, let me say a few words about what are the dominant cultures today and how they're changing. Of course, they did change after the Cold War. The dominant culture was, as I said, the geopolitical culture. It was a culture where security was assured by military forces, and the threat of another war was seen as the worst possible threat that could happen, and therefore the armed forces were a symbol of keeping that threat away, and it was very important for the legitimacy of governments that they were seen to prevent a war in Europe. And paradoxically, this model of security was exported all over the world through the arms trade, through military assistance. It created a kind of international military order where you stood on the pecking order was where you were expected to do in an imaginary war. Whoever would have the most soldiers, the most advanced technology were imagined to do better in a future war, and that determined the hierarchy of nations. And of course, underlying that was actually a general agreement about international law. It was international law which fundamentally emphasized sovereignty and non-interference rather than human rights and the kinds of things we're concerned about now. But there was a sort of general agreement about the importance of these issues. Now, after 1989, what we see is the emergence of, if you like, competing cultures. And one of them is what I call new wars. You might think it's odd that I describe new wars as a culture, but I've increasingly started to think of them as this. When I originally wrote the New Wars book, I was very much criticized on the grounds that contemporary wars aren't necessarily new empirically. And I felt that that actually missed the point. Because what I was trying, maybe I was wrong to use the word new, but if I hadn't used new, people wouldn't have attacked me. And it was very good that people attacked me because it created a debate. But, you know, maybe another term like hybrid, I don't know what the term would have been a better term. Non-linear, the Russian version of it all. But the point was I was trying to draw attention was to a difference of logic. And the logic of old war was that this is a deep-rooted political contest in which one side has to win. And that's why Clausewitz argued that the inner tendency of war was to the extreme and people throw everything into it in order to win. The logic of these wars are very different. They're wars in which the various armed groups who consist of mixes of state and non-state actors, they were militias, armed groups, criminal gangs, warlords, actually gain from violence itself rather than from winning or losing. So they, battles are rare, most of the violence is directed against civilians, and they're gaining economically through loot, through setting up checkpoints where they charge fees to pass, through smuggling, through kidnapping, all of these activities. So they gain economically, but they also gain ideologically because sectarian, ethnic, or religious identities are constructed through violence. And when you're afraid you get, because somebody from another ethnicity is going to kill you, you really have very little choice but to turn to your own ethnicity. So they're also quite good for generating extremist ideologies as well. So the tendency of, so that's why I call them a culture, because they have an inner tendency to reproduce themselves. They don't tend to the extreme, they tend to persistence, and they create large areas of what people now call forever wars. But in a way, they're almost like a kind of social system, like communism or market fundamentalism. These are social systems that are based on violence. And so that's what I mean by new wars as a culture, which is something that emerged after the end of the Cold War. I think I used Bosnia as my typical example, but we saw it, we've seen it ever since, and we're now beginning to see it in Sudan. But this other security culture, which emerged after the end of the Cold War, is what, for the moment, I'll call the liberal peace. So there was a big growth in peacekeeping, in NGOs, in international agencies, in humanitarianism, in what Mark Duffield calls the strategic complex that responded to new wars. I think, I mean, obviously the liberal peace, and liberal peace, I think broadly you can say is what characterizes, if geopolitics is linked to nation states and new wars are somehow the culture of subnational units, entities, whatever you want to call them, cantons, I don't know, then the liberal peace is linked to international and regional organizations like the UN and the EU. And of course, there are lots of contradictions in the liberal peace, and there's a tension between the emphasis on top-down peace agreements and the emphasis on human rights and human security. And we could talk about that. This would be a whole nother lecture to go into it. But nevertheless, I think altogether, this is an alternative security culture. And the kind of international law that's emphasized is very much more about human rights law, about international criminal law, and all of these sorts of issues. So what you're seeing now is a world of competing security cultures, which is quite problematic instead of and nobody really agrees. And I think it's particularly important in terms of international law, because international law only really works if everybody agrees on what it is. So why do I say that now is another turning point? I mean, many people have said, oh, the Ukraine war marks the return of geopolitics. And it marks the return of old war. I don't think so, actually. And that's what I really want to talk about. I think what we've learned from the Ukraine war is something that we actually should have learned from Vietnam, from Korea, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, which is that classic military aggression no longer works. War has become impossible. The imaginary war that the geopolitical people imagine is just that, it's imaginary. It couldn't become a reality. I mean, if it did become a reality, it would mean human extinction. And it's kind of mad when you hear American generals talking about all the latest advances, because, you know, it's really impossible nowadays, I think, to gain a decisive military advantage. What you can do, military technology is hugely destructive. Military force is hugely destructive, and it's very good at creating chaos. It's very good at producing a new war culture. That's what we learned from Iraq. That's what we learned from Afghanistan. But it's really difficult to do what Thomas Schelling called compellence, making the other side do what you want to do. And because it's possible to defend, but it's really difficult to attack because all military technology has become so incredibly lethal. So even the IEDs that the new warriors have are very effective against the tanks and aircraft of the Americans, which is why they prefer to do airstrikes. So I suppose so my argument is that the result is that what I think military force means is that either you do try to fight an old war and it escalates and you get nuclear war and human extinction, or it turns into a war of attrition in which the likely outcome is disintegration. Now, if we take the case of Ukraine, I really, really hope, and I was just saying to Kate from Ukraine just a few minutes ago, I really, really hope the Ukrainian counteroffensive works and the Russian morale collapses. That would be the ideal scenario. But unfortunately, I mean, it may work. I don't want to say it won't, but I think it is likely to get bogged down. And it's really dangerous at this moment that, you know, a very likely scenario, which is actually what I think Putin wanted originally, not when he invaded in February of last year, but when he went into Donbass. What he wanted to achieve was a new war situation. They called it non-linear war. They called it chaos. They wanted to create this because it was an alternative to democracy. And that's exactly what Putin did in Chechnya. He did it in Syria. He did it in the Donbass. He did it in Georgia. He created these ethnic statelets that really weakened and undermined democracy. By the way, democracy in Russia itself, and not just in all these other places. And what we're seeing at the moment in Ukraine is that the war effort really holds together through an incredible civil society effort. Ukraine has the most active civil society that I've ever come across in my life. And in fact, in all of the new wars I study, there's always an active civil society, which is the possible counter to the new war security culture. But in the case of Ukraine, it's networks of civil society that are providing weapons to individual battalions, that are providing healthcare, that are providing education. And at the same time, we have a situation with dramatic falls in national income, dramatic falls in wages, big increases in unemployment, and of course, the spread of weapons to all citizens. And at the same time, you know, the fear that at the moment, Ukrainians are very solid in their idea of a political concept of Ukraine that includes Russians and Ukrainians and Jews and Poles, but, you know, that hatred of Russia could spill over. So all the ingredients are there without a real effort on the part both of Ukraine and the international community for a possible long new war. And so I suppose what I'm really, in the end, I think, you know, the war can only end if there's change inside Russia, which is quite a depressing conclusion. Even if we get negotiations, and I have a lot to say about negotiations, but for time reasons, I'm not going to go on about it. But even if we have negotiations, I mean, I know we have a lot of people here from Bosnia, and Dayton is supposed to be the best of the peace agreements. We had Minsk. Even if we get negotiations and we get a reduction in violence, we get a continuation of the new war culture, because these top-down negotiations really do entrench the warlords, the militias, the various warring parties. So that's a very depressing scenario, which means we really need to start thinking differently. And where I see some hope and opportunity is that these questions are all currently being asked within NATO, which really surprised me. That suddenly, I mean, a senior NATO official said to me, Ukraine has been a wake-up call. We've been planning for a war that involves millions of civilian casualties. It's just impossible. We can't do that anymore. And as some of you might have noticed, that in the strategic concept that was published in June, the Madrid concept, they actually included a commitment to human security, women, peace and security, and climate change in the strategic concept. Of course, that doesn't mean that's brought about a change in NATO, because the structures are still built around nuclear weapons, conventional weapons, deployments. But it's a moment of change. And I think adding to that moment of change is the Europeanization of NATO. And I think that this is partly happening because of the Trump years, but it's also the addition of the extra European countries, especially Sweden Sweden not yet, and Finland. So I think there's a moment of big thinking going on, which I feel people like us could take advantage of. But what we need is to be able to produce really convincing evidence-based research, which shows the different ways that we could change and shift security culture. And I want to say a few words, but I haven't got much more time, on what that means. I mean, I think, first of all, of course, it does mean a change in the nature of our political institutions. It means that states do have to see themselves as members of a multilateral system, rather than as sovereign independent states. I say that coming from horrible old Brexit land, but where people have been moving in the opposite direction, and we know they're moving in the opposite direction in a lot of places. But anyway, that's one issue. Secondly, of course, it means a greater emphasis on human rights rather than war. And we have to reconceptualize war as a massive violation of human rights, because that's what it is. Thirdly, it really does mean a shift in expenditure away from military expenditure to climate change, to reducing poverty, to global healthcare. But fourthly, it also means a change in the composition of military spending. I think a world that was based on a human-centered global conception of security would still need military forces. But what would they be needed for? Well, on the one hand, as Ukraine shows us, they are needed to defend against aggression. But being defensive doesn't mean doesn't require also to be offensive. There's a balance between defensive and offensive, and especially it shouldn't require nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons only work through offense and through threatening. Well, we could say lots more about that. So it would have to be conventional defense or non-nuclear deterrence. And interestingly, people in the Baltics and Poland who are really nervous about nuclear retaliation are actually thinking along those lines. And the other role for military forces would be as part, not as all, of peace missions, for protecting civilians, for monitoring ceasefires, for creating humanitarian corridors. And we could say a lot about what needs to be done to rethink how we deal with new wars. If we think of new wars as a culture rather than a contest, then we think about how do you reverse the culture rather than about a top-down peace agreement. And so I think that's really important. And there is a sort of limited role for the military and all that. And I think there's also an important discussion to be had about military technology and about the future of new technologies such as AI, space. You know, how do you ensure they're human-centered? And of course, what to do about the vested interests of the defense industry and the arms trade. So there's a huge agenda, which I could probably continue for several hours, but I won't. It's just to give you a little bit of what's there. But I think it gives us an agenda, which is really important to be pursuing. So basically, my point is there's a lot to do if we're going to make a difference. I'm not being very optimistic. I mean, I see a moment of change in NATO in response to what's been happening in the Ukraine war. But at the same time, we also see the spread of authoritarianism, the spread of oligarchies, political marketplaces, crony capitalism and dictatorships, many of which disintegrate into new wars. And so it's not a very hopeful world. But what is clear is if there is a sort of possibility of a change here on the European continent, it could have incredible global ramifications. And so I think there's a real responsibility on us to try to help make that change. And that's where I'll stop. So people like to ask questions. Yeah, Owen.
Just to kick it off, Mary, thanks very much. It's very stimulating. But I wonder whether I think my question is really to encourage you to elucidate for a couple more minutes about what needs to be what are the conditions in terms of, if we're looking in the next couple of years, in terms of outcomes in Ukraine and Taiwan Straits and all of that, that actually makes that inflection point something that one can really exploit? Because obviously a narrative of Russian victory in Ukraine would not be a turning point that would enable that to happen. So implicit in everything, well, explicit in everything you've said is, resistance of that. And similarly, obviously, there's the high geostrategy in South China Seas and, around a very particular set of interests. So I'd just be interested in you elucidating what would be the sort of conditions over the outcomes over the next 2 or 3 years that would allow that space for essentially confirming the fact that sort of the old imaginary wars are generally imaginary in the sense that they won't achieve things.
Well, let me say two things. I mean, I think the point is that already the Soviet invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the way in which Putin has threatened nuclear weapons has produced the rethinking in NATO. It really doesn't matter what happens in Ukraine. People have recognized that there is a real danger. And I guess, the worst thing would be is if the war goes on at a low level and people lose interest. But I think that, it is quite likely, but that would have repercussions for the rest of Europe. I mean, if it turned into a new war on our borders, with all the implications of smuggling, of the spread of violence, the spread of extremism, that would be very bad and would illustrate the need for a change. But you're really asking me what would be a good option that could turn us into, that could make human security a reality. And I suppose an only good option, which I feel is, unfortunately, is rather unlikely, so I'm quite pessimistic, really, would be the fall of Putin and the return of democracy in Russia. And ideally, the spread of democracy in China. Of course, that's what we want eventually. But what I do feel is, I don't think that the expansion of NATO caused the war in Ukraine. In fact, I always say to people, if we really want to blame the West, I think where the West was to blame was in its neoliberal economic policies. I think that contributed to the creation of the kind of oligarchic dictatorship that you have in Russia. I don't think the expansion of NATO was the cause, but it did provide a pretext. And the problem was that at the end of the Cold War, NATO absolutely was the epitome of the geopolitical culture, whereas the Helsinki process, which had gone before, had been a human security culture. And I think if you'd got a shift from NATO to Helsinki, we would be in a very, very different place today. And the problem with the expansion of NATO was that it was objectively provocative, because why were you expanding conventional forces if you didn't think there was a threat from Russia? So it was objectively exclusive. Doesn't mean that that's why Russia invaded or that Russia had to invade, but it was a problem. So if you had an adaptation of NATO from geopolitics to human security, so it was more like a sort of Helsinki process in the awakening, then the whole point of this idea is that you would provide effective defense without threatening attack, without being provocative. And that would actually weaken the sort of authoritarian pretext for going to war. So that's, I suppose, why I think it would make a big difference. I do think, I hope that already we've seen from Ukraine, I hope that's made it clear to the Chinese how difficult it would be to invade Taiwan. And of course, it would be much more difficult because it has to be done by sea to invade Taiwan than it was to invade Ukraine. Yeah. My old friends are the ones who come ask the questions.
That's not my intention, though. Just so I had two thoughts. One is that I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on a concept that you gestured towards but didn't really expound on, which is this idea of non-offensive defense, which actually has its roots in the later stages of the Cold War and was something that, broadly speaking, the peace research and peace movement community could buy into, because there's clearly a tension here between advocating solutions that recognize the role of military alliances and institutions and wanting to see this as an inflection moment for peace and peace research. So that's my first question: is can we resuscitate Phoenix-like and rethink those kind of ideas? And then my second is, when you refer to the Helsinki process, there was a clear choice in the early 1990s, principally in the United States, to go the NATO route and not the OSCE path. There were some NATO allies, such as Canada and a few others, that actually wanted to invest more heavily diplomatically and politically and otherwise in building up the OSCE. I can't say that the organization is dead, but it's on life support. And maybe rather than just focusing on reorienting NATO, we might want to think about what the broader ecosystem is of potential multilateral security institutions that we could work with in that sense, because the Russians at least had bought into, for a while, the OSCE project. Those are my two.
Did you mean NATO or OSCE was on life support?
OSCE.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's quite dangerous now to introduce Helsinki because people feel so disappointed by Helsinki that maybe we need another term. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I was very much thinking of the discussions we had in the 1980s about the idea of non-offensive defense. And there's a wonderful book produced by Pugwash called The Foundations of Defensive Defense that I found in the LSE library. Nobody had looked at it for 30 years, which was developed by a group of East-West authors. And the idea was exactly what I was trying to explain, that it was, you could have defense in depth that would be very effective, given the effectiveness of modern anti-offense, I mean, anti-missile, anti-aircraft, anti-naval weapons, without having offensive weapons that would threaten to attack the other side. Although you might have to have a few, but the balance is what's important. So you wouldn't look provocative, because the key problem about deterrence is that you threaten, you know, you say, if you attack me, I'll retaliate with nuclear weapons or whatever. And that immediately looks like you're a threat and justifies. So that was the idea in the night. And what has been very, very interesting in recent years is that because of the reduction of American conventional forces in Europe, the Baltic states and Poland have got really nervous about the tripwire. I don't know, most of you may remember the tripwire was something brought in by Eisenhower in the 1950s. And the idea is that if the Soviet Union were to attack conventionally, NATO would immediately respond with nuclear weapons. And this was supposed to be effective deterrence. And that's been the argument that's been brought back in the Baltics and Poland and has rightly made them feel very nervous. So that has generated a whole discussion about defense in depth, comprehensive defense, resilience, and among these states, which is very interesting. And also within NATO, they call it deterrence by denial rather than deterrence by retaliation. So I think that's a terribly interesting way to go and to push, because I think there's a sort of open door in NATO on that. And if you think about when Putin was threatening the use of nuclear weapons, Biden did make it explicit that he would respond conventionally. And if that's the case, what on earth is the point of nuclear weapons? You know, you start thinking, what are they all doing? And we're in this moment when nearly all the nuclear powers are modernizing like mad because their weapons are so old. And it's a very dangerous moment. So, and you know, there's also the danger, which Niels and I were discussing, that if the West does give in to Russian nuclear threats, then that's a recipe for dictators everywhere to acquire nuclear weapons. So it's a moment of great rethink. On your point, yes, of course, I think that. And I think that we should be thinking about, and actually I should have said that, because if you think that human security is built into the African Union's mandate, and Latin America, it's not human security, it's human rights, but it's really important, and it's gone quite far in Latin America, and you know, in terms of the Latin American court and all of those things, less far in Asia. I think we are thinking about regional organizations, and that having an effective human security policy by regional is actually a way of strengthening those organizations as part of a system of global governance. So I've talked a lot about the EU and NATO, and I do think that will make a fundamental change. But I also think you're absolutely right. We need to think of a global multilateral system, and in which there's a sort of virtuous circle of strengthening regional organizations to deal with lots of issues, not just classic security, but climate change, health, all of these issues. You know, one of the ways I think about the concept of human security, we're always told human security is about the individual rather than the state, and it's about defending the individual from material threats like poverty or climate change, and not just about physical threats like war. But I think there's another way of thinking about it, which is that those of us who live in rights-based, law-governed societies really take human security for granted. We expect that when there's a crisis, flooding, a terrorist attack, a pandemic, there will be healthcare workers, police, firefighters, and so on to come to our aid. And of course, historically, the construction of these kinds of societies was based on the total opposite in the rest of the world, on colonialism, on excluding people. But I think what human security is really about is trying to extend that model of security. We have a completely different internal model of security from our external model. And nowadays, there's no out there, there's no externality. We're all on the same planet. So it is about extending this internal model globally. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm a security student from Cardiff. I just wanted to ask, when you were talking about nations being viewed as sort of nodes in a network rather than sovereign states, what exactly did you mean, or what would that kind of entail? Do you mean an organization like the European Union or something else?
That's exactly what I mean. I mean, you know, we're members of the European Union, which alas, we aren't any longer. We do give up the autonomous use of force. We don't define our states. States were historically war-making machines. And they gradually acquired all these other functions, and these other functions have taken over. But we, you know, what I imagine is that we'll still have states. They'll still provide, although even that, I mean, we were just talking about Flanders. You know, we imagine a shift of competencies among different layers of institutions, and the state is no longer views itself. It never was. I mean, the state was always dependent on mutual recognition by other states, and that mutual recognition always came with some kind of agreement about the international rules. But those rules have become much thicker and more dense. We have a mass of international regulation now. And in the old rules, war was legal. You know, you had to declare a war. The only war that was legal was between states. Domestic laws weren't legal. And you had to fight it, although you never did, according to in bello rules. But so what we're talking about is a very fundamental change in states from being war-making institutions that simply to becoming part of the global administered state. I think that's space. You know, the whole world is now administered, and we have various institutions that are nodes in that. And that's what I imagine. And I imagine sort of, I mean, we're moving in that direction anyway, but we need to move a lot faster if we're going to address climate change, if we're going to address all the global problems we need to address, global redistribution.
The argument is with one state, there's no competition from other states because they...
No, it's part of it can be competitive, but within an agreed set of rules.
Oh, right.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Saskia Bassa. I work for the Quaker Council for European Affairs here in Brussels. Thanks so much for very interesting input. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit what I see as a bit of a contradiction. You're saying there's many positive developments happening right now in NATO, conversations around women, peace and security, environmental issues, etc. But at the same time, they're saying that in order to do this transition into a new role in the security architecture, they need more resources, which in my opinion is in contradiction with the other point around reducing military expenditure and redirecting those resources to more social, pro-social roles in society. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that, and on the other hand, also the role of the arms trade in this new security infrastructure too, a new conception of security. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that, on the conflict of interest that comes with profiting from war as a business activity. Thank you.
There's a huge amount to say on all that. And of course, NATO says, I mean, we're talking, if NATO were serious about women, peace and security and about human security and about climate change, we would expect a diversion of resources from military spending to these other causes. So, you know, the problem of NATO changing is they see these issues as sort of additions. And in my discussions with NATO people, not all of them see it like that, but many people see human security as something you do alongside traditional military operations. But actually, that's a contradiction in terms. They really see it, for them, it's the protection of civilians agenda, which is very much part of taking international humanitarian law seriously. That's, I think, how they see it. But actually, human security is more than that, the protection of civilians. Protection of civilians is not something you do alongside your military objectives. It is the objective itself. So if you think in international humanitarian law, the killing of civilians is permitted in cases where it's necessary to achieve the military objective, and the military objective will lead to victory that is proportionate to the gains from victory will be proportionate to the harms that have been undertaken. That's the rule in international humanitarian law. I think once you start thinking in human security, it's exactly the opposite. So the killing of enemies is permitted only if it's necessary to protect civilians. So in general, killing is not permitted. International humanitarian law permits the killing of soldiers. Human security does not, except in circumstances which is typical of self-defense. You know, you can, if the only way to protect yourself is to kill the other guy, you can justify yourself. And, you know, we can make that argument in relation to Ukraine, that killing Russians is actually necessary to defend Ukrainians. But then, of course, there's lots of other questions. So I think that's the first point. Do they really understand what it means? And it's our job to really make all those kinds of points. And then your other question was about the arms trade. And I think we need a very fundamental restructuring of defense industries. Actually, you know, the arms trade was where I came in. My very first job was making the arms trade statistics at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And I'm very proud of that. I think it's the thing I'm most proud of in my life, because those statistics still exist and still continue. And I invented the methodology. And I think even at that time, the point is that arms exports aren't terribly beneficial economically, but they are important for the survival of defense companies. And what's more, I think something additional has happened in the last 20 years, is that they've become a very important element in the funding of crony capitalists. I mean, I'm always completely amazed at these poor countries which buy advanced weapon systems when there's really no conceivable use for them. But they do provide, through bribes and the rest, a source of income for political parties and for politicians, along with things like creaming off state contracts, oil revenues, all these other things. And so I think that's become, corruption, if you like, has become a very important factor in sustaining the arms trade. So what does that mean we have to think about? Well, I think we obviously have to go back, again, going back to the 80s, like Keith was suggesting. You know, at that time, the trades unions were all proposing really imaginative and exciting proposals for converting defense industries. I think we should go back to that and start talking about the conversion of defense industries and the use of those technologies for purposes like health and climate change and so on. And I think transparency for dealing with corruption, and not only transparency, but a great increase in the commitment to international justice, both at a local and a national level. You can't deal with corruption just through transparency. You really have to have cases, court cases, you know, things like the Magnitsky are very, very important. So I will stop there because I can see what Nils is saying.
Well, yeah, it's a pity, but it's already after 6 and it's getting a bit late. But I would like to thank you very much for this very inspiring speech that really touched upon several of the topics that we've been discussing earlier today, but that we will also be discussing tomorrow. So hereby I'm also closing the online events that we're doing today. But for those who are still here, I would like to invite you all for a reception, a glass and a drink, so we can continue the conversation, and then we can see each other later tomorrow as well. Okay, thank you.